Welcome. The lesson that we are going to study is Globalization, Development and Society. And the module that we are going to do is Globalization and Class Polarization. Let's understand that class is a sociological category primarily identified with Karl Marx. How does the process of globalization has affected the class relation, the formation of the class? All these things would be the focus of our today's discussion. So let's begin. Globalization has been defined in terms of movement of people and technology across the world. It is not a new phenomenon in the history of mankind. People travel to faraway places and sometimes settle in other countries for their economic and cultural pursuits. At times, they also left their land because they were being pursued by those in power, and they had to flee the land and look for new places where they could settle and survive. In economic terms, the globalization has to be understood as a process of opening up of national markets for foreign companies. The government also encourages the domestic companies to invest in other companies. This is believed to result in level field for the open competition amongst the companies and businessmen across the globe. The new thrust to globalization seems to have started with the formation of WTO and signing of General Agreement of Trade and Tariff, commonly known as the GATT, as well as General Agreement on Services. These agreements compelled the countries to open up their economy for global competition. Proponents of globalization who point to the boon that results from the trade in goods and services between countries argue that global integration increases average income within countries and therefore reduces poverty and inequality amongst people due to trickling down of wealth. The other group of thinkers, primarily the Marxists, feel that the globalization is leading to polarization of classes as predicted by Karl Marx. Let's understand how this happens. The Marxists cite rising inequalities and income differentials in the capitalist society as an example of the polarization of the classes. Thus, there are two kinds of view about the debate as to whether globalization is leading towards polarization of classes or not. Let us analyze the two viewpoints one by one to understand whether the correlation between the globalization and the polarization exists or not. First, we shall focus on the argument of the Marxists that globalization has resulted in the polarization of the classes. Marxian analysis of globalization is the historical development of contradiction between the forces of the production and the relations of the production. It is believed that capitalism can only thrive on the exploitation of the working classes. Marxism believes that there was a real contradiction between human nature and the way that we must work in a capitalist society. Marx's concept of polarization of the classes describes the historical process of the class structure becoming increasingly polarized, pushed to two ends with nothing in the middle. Much of the rhetoric of class analysis, especially in the Marxist tradition, characterizes class relations in fairly stark, simplified, and polarized terms. Class struggles are portrayed as battles between the bourgeois and the proletariat, between lords and the serf, between slave masters and the slaves. Marxism believes that soon classes will disappear and be absorbed either into the bourgeois or the proletariat. Polarization of classes in Marxian analysis is the inevitable historical process of the class structure becoming increasingly polarized. Instead of merely asserting a tendency toward a polarization of classes, Karl Marx predicted ever-increasing misery for the mass of the population. And it was this ever-increasing misery that would lead the masses to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Simply speaking, Marx was talking that the class in itself would turn to a class for itself. Marxists believe that the new waves of globalization are not made in the spirit of free trade, resulting in benefit to all the countries of the world. Instead, this leads to the benefit to the developed country as the expanse of developing countries of the world, since this agreement allows the multinational companies of the developed countries to compete with the small-scale industries in developed country, resulting in the huge losses for the latter. What are the economic disparities in the world? According to various surveys, inequality is one of the key challenges of our time. Income inequality specifically is one of the most visible aspects of a broader and more complex issue, one that entails inequality of opportunity and extends to gender, ethnicity, disability, and age, among others. This affects all countries around the world. In developed and developing countries alike, the poorest half of the population often controls less than 10% of its wealth. This is a universal challenge that the whole world must address. Let's look at this slide which shows the economic disparities of the world. If you would see the Gini index, for the USA it is 14.81 and for South Africa it is 63.14. You can see the difference that is there as of the years. So through globalization goes the argument the wages of a segment of the workforce increase, but the same doesn't happen for other segment. So the gap in between keeps on increasing. The wages of the segment of the workforce, which is usually low skilled and low wage workers, drop as a result of less demand for their skill, while the wages of higher skilled workers increase. The answer, says Muskin, lies in contrasting the benefit to an economy as a whole against the negative effect on a certain segment of workers. Let's try and understand the rise of the middle class. This is the other view which we are going to discuss now. The antecedent for the view that globalization benefit all is typically attributed to 19th century British economist David Ricardo. While explaining the benefits of the trade as a result of industrialization and cheap transportation, primarily because of steamships and railways. The increase in volume of global trade and increase in wealth of nations seems to support the above view. This view is also supported by the data which shows that the number of people in the middle class has increased. This potential increase in the global middle class is associated with a significant geographical redistribution, as almost all of the new number of the global middle class reside in the Asian continent. Today, there are only 500 million middle class consumers in Asia, while 1/4 of these are in Japan. Within 20 years, there would be a six-fold increase to some 3.2 billion people. Asia's share in the global middle class would rise from just 1/4 today to 2/3 by 2030. Meanwhile, North America and Europe could see their combined share drop from 54% to just 17%. Partly this reflects slow population growth in these regions, but it also reflects the fact that many people could graduate out of the middle class and become rich by 2030. The United Nations describe it as a historic shift not seen for 150 years. The new global middle class in China, India and Brazil have propelled their economies to equal the size of the industrialized G7 country. By 2050, they are forecast to account for nearly half of the world output, far surpassing the G7. Plus, within a decade, the middle class in Europe and North America will be less than 1/3 of world's total, down from more than half now. The Brookings Institute estimate that there are 1.8 billion in the middle class, which will grow to 3.2 billion by the end of the decade. Asia is almost entirely responsible for this growth. Its middle class is forecast to triple to 1.7 billion by 2020. By 2030, Asia will be the home to 3 billion middle class people. It would be 10 times more than North America and 5 times more than Europe. There is also a substantial growth in the rest of the emerging world. The middle class in Latin America is expected to grow from 181 million to 313 million by 2030, led by Brazil. And in Africa and the Middle East, it is projected to more than double from 137 million to 341 million. According to organizations like United Nations and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, it's someone who earns or spends $10 to $100 per day. That's when you have disposable income and enough money to consume things like refrigerator, or you can think of buying an automobile. As the UN suggests, the growth is being driven by industrialization. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century transformed the economies of the Britain, the US and the Germany in big way. They gave a class which was the consumption class. They had money and capability to buy things off the shelf from the market. Thus, there was a huge market-driven economy in this country which led to their prosperity. The move from agrarian to industrial society generated income rises that created the middle class. With the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the China's entry into capitalism, Marx and his ideas on communism and class receded into the background. No longer was the class conflict believed to determine the course of the history. Instead, there seemed to emerge a prosperous era of free trade and free enterprise. The sweeping influence of globalization, which connected the most remote corners of the planet in financial bond, outsourcing and borderless manufacturing, offered everybody the opportunity to make money with the help of the capitalist tool of trade, entrepreneurship and foreign investment. Through this phenomena, the world was supposed to behold possibly the most extraordinary process of poverty elevation in human history, as capitalism seemed to be realizing its promised goal to ensure for everyone wealth and welfare. But that did not happen in reality. Instead, the global economy went into a long drawn-out polarization crisis in which workers all over the world faced joblessness, debt, and stagnant income. Thus, Marx's critique of capitalism being a system that is inherently unjust and self-destructive became more relevant in contemporary times. Marx had hypothesized that the capitalist system would undoubtedly give rise to the impoverishment of the masses when the world's wealth would land up in the hands of a greedy few, and this would result in an economic crisis and heightened conflict between the rich and the working class. The anti-globalizers provide stats to show that rich are getting richer while the middle class and the poor are not. It is pointed out that this widening inequality is once again giving rise to class polarization and class struggle, as workers of the world are increasingly growing outraged and enraged and demanding their share of the global economy. In the US, society has been perceived as split between the 99%, that is, the common people who are struggling to eke out a living, and 1%, the influential and the privileged super rich who are getting richer every day. In France, budget cuts have made the rich-poor divide glaringly obvious to the ordinary citizen. The rich-poor divide is also creating problems in China. Even in rapidly expanding emerging market, tension between rich and poor is becoming a primary concern for policymakers. There is the idea of iron rice bowl. The Mao era practice of guaranteeing workers job for life has ended with Maoism, and during the reform era, workers have had few rights. Vandana Shiva takes issue with the world is flat view of Thomas Friedman, one of the supporters of globalization. She criticizes Friedman, who was of the view that globalization is a leveler of inequalities in society and creates a flat world. According to Vandana Shiva, Friedman's view of globalization is lopsided, as is his analysis of globalization. Friedman focuses only on laws, regulations, and policy, which act as protections of the weak and the vulnerable, on barriers necessary as boundary conditions for the exercise of freedom and democracy, rights and justice, peace and security, sustainability, and sharing of the earth's precious and vital resources. He, however, leaves out the bit about the brutality of the exploitation and inequality, the social and ecological consequences of economic globalization and free trade, the partition of insecurity and hatred and fear of intellectual property, walls of privatization, and that globalization is erecting steadily and slowly. Freeland agrees with this view and adds that class, in fact, has been a forbidden subject in politics in order to laud the benefit of globalization. No one speaks about the ever-increasing gap between the super elites of all society and everyone else, or about how the old promise of social mobility is no longer delivering. It is failing day in and day out. However, it is also clear that Marx's revolution is not happening either. Although workers may have common problem, they are not coming together to put an end to them. Instead, what class conflict is producing today are appeals to rewire economic systems so they become more viable and sustainable through equitable distribution of the wealth that has been created. The rising economic inequalities supplemented by social inequality seem to suggest that the world will witness class conflict in the time to come. However, the rising number of middle class in the world seems to suggest that the polarization will not occur and the world will continue to benefit an ever-increasing middle class. The debate rages on and whether the workers of the world may just unite and Marx may yet have his revenge as suggested by Schumann, or whether globalization may lead to a new world order remains to be seen. Karl Marx said, "The history of all hitherto existing society is nothing else but a history of class struggle." In this era of globalization, we are still to see if around inequities and perceived inequality, whether workers of the world will unite or the middle class will find fault with this analysis all over again, as Marx had talked about polarization of classes and never ever thought that there would be a middle class. Thank you.